It has been 2 decades since the world witnessed the horrors of a 3-month genocide in the small African nation of Rwanda. While the international consensus after the slaughter was never again, many now fear we may be witnessing it all over again in another nearby country, the Central African Republic. And joining us now on the line from Washington, D.C. for more on the ethnic violence that has swept across that country, Naomi Kikoler. She is Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. And Naomi, it's good to have you, a Torontonian, back on the air here on TVO. How are you doing?
Very good. Thank you so much for having me.
Not at all. Just before we begin our conversation here, let's put up some facts about this country that I suspect many of our viewers don't know at all. It has not been in the news much until lately. But here's the Central African Republic, estimated population of just over 5 million people. Its religious makeup, indigenous beliefs, a little over a third, Protestant about a quarter, Roman Catholic about a quarter, Muslim about 15%. Those numbers according to the CIA World Factbook. And then these are some facts from your organization, Naomi. More than 325,000 civilians have sought refuge in neighboring countries because of the recent violence. There are more than 630,000 internally displaced persons. And this is now ranked as a, quote, level 3 humanitarian emergency by the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. That is the highest level of humanitarian crisis. Now, as we start our conversation here, we're going to show some photos as well that some journalists and others have taken to give people a sense of what's going on there right now. But when you were there and when your plane landed, what did you see?
Well, it's really quite startling. As soon as you arrive in Bangui, the capital, you're hit by the enormity of the crisis. Because when your plane lands, you look out the window and what you see is essentially a camp of displaced persons. There are 50,000 people who live alongside the landing strip at the airport. And those people are now people who've been displaced for many months and live in very, very dire conditions.
And they are there because why?
Those that live alongside the landing strip at the airport are predominantly Christians, although there are some Muslims amongst them, who were displaced beginning in March 2013 when a coup took place in the country and fighting began between a group called the Seleka, which were a primarily Islamist armed group, and then at that time the armed forces of the Central African Republic.
Who presumably are not Muslim.
At the time, I mean, it was a slightly mixed armed forces. What essentially happened was the Seleka overthrew the then government led by the former President Bozize. They created their own government. They were then essentially ousted. There was pressure placed on the individual who took over, Jatodia, to step down in January 2014, and a transitional government was put in place. And since then, we've essentially seen fighting, primarily led by a group called the Anti-Balaka, who are a bit of an ad hoc mishmash of Christian self-defense groups, although there are some Muslims amongst them, which shows the complexity of it, former government armed forces, and then also essentially roving bandits, criminals, who are targeting primarily the Muslim community within the Central African Republic.
Any children among this group as well?
There are children, and there were children, unfortunately, that were part of the Seleka. The Seleka advanced across the country and perpetrated crimes from March until January. There were children in their ranks, and there are now young children in the Anti-Balaka. When I saw Anti-Balaka in a very rural part outside of the capital, you know, they looked like they were young teenagers. They're drunk, they're armed, and they're unfortunately very deadly.
Now, I remember a couple of decades ago, there were observations made about similar problems in the Balkans, where you had people who had lived side by side for generations, who intermarried, who had friends among the different religious groups or different ethnicities, and suddenly taking up arms and killing each other. Is that what's happening here now as well?
It's a very complicated situation, and I think that what we see, unfortunately, is a manipulation of religious and ethnic identity by individuals who want to secure political power or of economic interest in the country. And they're using religion as a way to create differences amongst people to secure their own interests. And unfortunately, what has happened and what has transpired in the past few months is that 80% of the country's Muslim population has either been forced from their homes or killed.
How does that happen, where on one day you can marry your neighbor who is of a different ethnicity, and then the next day you can somehow buy into propaganda that they are subhuman and need to be killed? How does that happen?
This is one of the challenges that we really wrestle with. In the Central African Republic, you did see communities living side by side. There were some intermarriage that took place. Generally, most that you speak to talk of there being good senses of tolerance amongst the different communities, but that it was slowly whittled away. When you talk to the average person, they refer to the Muslim community as essentially being foreigners, even though in many cases you had seen people living within the country for multiple generations. You also hear people talk in a very derogatory sense about the Muslims owning all the businesses, keeping the money amongst themselves. So there were some probably kind of perceived grievances that were seized upon by influential actors who then are trying to manipulate those to carry out their own ends and are willing to use violence to essentially achieve control and power.
Any idea how many people have been killed so far?
It's really difficult to find out, and that's one of the most worrying aspects of this conflict. I know a lot of people have spoken about Rwanda, where we saw 10,000 people killed a day during a 100-day period. We don't have those types of numbers, but at the same time, while the stated number is 2,000 killed since December, we have to remember that no one's actually keeping a death toll in this particular case, and much of the country is fairly inaccessible. It's hard to reach many of the rural areas. We don't know how many people have been killed in many of the rural communities. We don't know how many people are currently starving in these remote locations. The sense from humanitarian colleagues on the ground is that unfortunately the death toll is probably very high. We just unfortunately do not know.
Probably higher than the 2,000 number though, yes? Vastly
higher.
Vastly higher. Let's talk about boots on the ground, because there are some efforts being undertaken at the moment by other countries to get involved in this crisis. France has apparently committed 2,000 troops to the cause. The African Union has talked about 6,000 peacekeepers on the ground. How successful have these efforts been, as far as you can tell?
Well, the starting point, I think that in the absence of the AU peacekeepers and the French troops, we would have seen even higher levels of mass atrocities being perpetrated. We've spoken to colleagues who refer to, a Srebrenica-style massacre having been averted in certain towns within the Central African Republic as a result of the presence of African Union peacekeepers. Having said that, it's incredibly difficult for these peacekeepers to provide the type of physical protection that we think is required. There are currently 12,000 Muslims living in 2 besieged communities within the capital, Bangui. And to just give you a small example of what that means, you have 2,000 people that are essentially surrounded by these roving bands of anti-Balaka. Every night you hear gunshots and grenades going off, and it's essentially clashes between the besieged Muslim community and the anti-Balaka, who are trying to kill them every time they step a few meters outside of this besieged area. It's very hard for peacekeepers to provide protection in that type of an environment.
And yet, as an indication, I guess, or a partial indication of how much more normal Rwanda is as a country today, I gather part of the African Union force are Rwandan soldiers. Is that right?
Yes, it's very true. And the Rwandan forces have been commended in many cases for the actions that they've taken to save lives. It's really quite telling. You see Rwandan peacekeepers, not just in the Central African Republic, but also in Darfur and elsewhere. One anecdote from a peacekeeper who was not Rwandan, but who himself was of Muslim descent. So he talked about how difficult it was as a Muslim peacekeeper to stand and watch as other people are being killed in front of them. And I think for the Rwandans, they feel that it is their obligation to ensure that others do not suffer the same atrocities that they experienced during their genocide in 1994.
The United Nations, I gather, unanimously endorsed sending a 12,000-strong peacekeeping force to the region. Only trouble is, I gather, it won't start until September. How helpful can that be if it's not starting for several months yet?
I think there are a lot of things that can be done in between now and September. The peacekeeping mission has essentially been created. Yes, it's in name alone. We won't see the added infusion of about another 7,000 troops and peacekeepers until September. But between now and then, the UN can invest in local level conflict resolution, mediation efforts between communities. There are still parts of the country where Christians and Muslims live together, and where there can be efforts undertaken taken to promote greater tolerance amongst those communities. The UN can also take steps to address the rampant culture of impunity, help to ensure that those that are committing crimes are arrested, detained, and prosecuted. We need physical protection on the ground. We need to see the European Union and others put troops there very quickly before September. But there are other steps in addition to actually having boots on the ground that are also needed to help save lives.
Such as?
I think some of the most immediate ones that can be undertaken, we've now seen, along with the creation of a peacekeeping mission, we've seen targeted sanctions against some of the individuals who are believed to be behind part of the violence and some of the support for the anti-Balaka, including the former President Bouazizi. We believe that international criminal court investigation and prosecution of those who are responsible for some of the crimes is also an important step. In addition to investing, as I mentioned, in the reconciliation and mediation efforts, messaging, saying that every member, every person from the Central African Republic is the same. It is a country of Christians and Muslims committed to one country, one peace, one nation, and that is a diverse nation. That's the type of messaging that we think needs to come from the government, from the UN system, and from international actors as well.
International actors, you've said, and a moment ago you said the European Union and others, and I want to read you something that was in the Globe and Mail last week to see whether or not Canada might be one of those others. Here's the quote. This is by Robert Rotberg. Why Canada? Because all the other capable Western countries are otherwise engaged or extended. Because Canada has the Francophone links. Because the CAR, Central African Republic, has been a country of concern for foreign affairs and the Canadian International Development Agency, CIDA. And most of all, because the CAR is a beleaguered, desperate, neglected country with no real friends beyond France. With comparatively modest exertion, deployment of a few thousand soldiers and up to 1,000 Mounties, Canada could help the French, EU, and African forces to restore order and the possibility of stability. Canada could make a difference. What do you think?
I think Robert is absolutely right. My experience within the Central African Republic only reaffirmed to me the special role that Canada can play in trying to bring order, stability, and also save lives from mass atrocities. Obviously, Canada was one of the champions of the Response to Protect, which is essentially the political framework that makes Never Again real. Part of upholding the Response to Protect includes things like contributing peacekeepers to a mission like the one in the Central African Republic. We were repeatedly told that for every one Western peacekeeper that you can contribute, that's the equivalent of 3 African Union peacekeepers. If we had 150 Canadian Special Forces that we could put on the ground to protect some of those besieged communities, I think we would go a long way to providing the type of physical protection that's required. We have the experience from Afghanistan. We have the resources to be able to do it. The fact that we are a bilingual country, I can't stress enough how critical that is in a country like the Central African Republic. But we should also look at other ways that we can assist. We've now provided $5 million in assistance to the MISCA, which is the African Union mission, and $5 million in humanitarian assistance. That's very commendable. I think we should also be looking at how to use some of the skills and resources that Canada has developed, for example, again in Afghanistan, on state building, on redrafting constitutions, on prosecuting people for mass atrocity crimes. We've got a bi-jural system. We have the type of experts that we could contribute to the Central African Republic and to support the UN mission.
Okay, you mentioned Afghanistan as a reason, giving us experience and expertise in this area, why we should go in. I can imagine there are people who will use Afghanistan as the example of why we should not go in, that we've already spent more than a dozen years and more than 150 lives in pursuit of a goal in Afghanistan that not everybody obviously is convinced was worth the price of blood and treasure. So what argument would you make to counter that Afghanistan is exactly the reason why we should avoid CAR?
Well, I think we have to be very clear that the situation in the Central African Republic is dramatically different than Afghanistan. The European Union is going to be sending a mission which Canada can contribute to. It is a time-limited mission. It's expected to withdraw at the same time that the United Nations peacekeeping mission, just shortly after that one is constituted in September. There's a way that Canada could go in for a short period of time and make a significant impact on the ground. I would also say that the situation in the Central African Republic is one in which which the United Nations has already taken a leadership role with the help of the European Union. We're not looking for Canada to be the primary actor. We're looking for Canada to play a support role in that particular context in a very limited sense, using some of the expertise that we have. It's not a situation where I think we could forecast that we would see, for example, a large death toll. It's important to underscore that the nature of the violence is very different than Afghanistan. We don't see the use of sophisticated weaponry like IEDs, for example. So the cost in terms of the physical risk associated, while they exist, are dramatically different than Afghanistan. And I don't see Canada playing a long-term role in trying to actually reestablish the country in the same way that we have in Afghanistan. So it's a dramatically different situation, but it's one in which the value add of Canada, I think, is quite significant.
Naomi, have you or any other international organization of significance made that actual ask to Prime Minister Harper or anybody in his government?
We've made it to different government officials, but not in a formal sense to Prime Minister Harper. And I would encourage many Canadians to ask that of their MPs. I think that we saw John Baird in a recent speech kind of marking the National Day of Atrocity Prevention on April 7th, reaffirm Canada's commitment to the notion of never again. I think what we unfortunately see from many governments is really wonderful rhetoric, but a slightly abysmal record when it comes to actually upholding some of those commitments. And I think that, you know, as we approach a number of anniversaries this month, including we just passed the 20th anniversary, we'll see the anniversary of Yom HaShoah, which was for the Holocaust. I think now is an appropriate time to ask of Prime Minister Harper and others, what can we do to make a difference in the Central African Republic? How can we actually uphold our commitment to never again and to the responsibility to protect?
20th anniversary you referred to as Rwanda, of course, a place you have been as well. When people talk about never again, and since you've been to the Central African Republic, do you see never again happening again?
I tend to take an optimistic look at this particular question. I think we have to recognize that we're dealing with something that is almost a generational change. I think when you deal with the reality of 80% of the Muslim community having been displaced, it's hard to argue that we have not failed the people of the Central African Republic. I was told by a minister who was Muslim, he said to me, if I leave this meeting wearing my traditional clothing, identifying myself as a Muslim, I will be hacked to death. I think that is a stunning indictment of the international community's failure to uphold the notion of never again. I say that, though, with the awareness that during the Rwandan genocide 20 years ago, the Security Council met to essentially try to shut down the peacekeeping mission that Senator Dallaire ran. Today, when the Security Council meets, it meets to discuss how to ensure that the peacekeepers actually make a difference. So we are seeing improvements. Unfortunately, it remains often too late to often avert many of the atrocity crimes that one could see potentially unfolding in a given country like the Central African Republic. But I will say that we have made strides in the last 20 years.
You just used the word genocide, which is a word that packs an awfully powerful punch when talking about the Holocaust or when talking about Rwanda of 20 years ago. I wonder, and it's a hard question to ask, but do you think the word has lost some of its punch in recent days?
I think that one of the challenges that we always face is that many governments wait until you invoke the language of genocide to act. And unfortunately, we often then act far too late. We shouldn't need to use the threat of genocide unfolding or hit the point in which genocide has happened for the international community to take steps to protect populations. And I think as a result, what we have seen is unfortunately a bit of a watering down at times of what that actual language means. In the case of the Central African Republic, there is the risk, as the United Nations has said, that genocide will unfold. What we know has happened already is that crimes against humanity and other atrocity crimes has happened. That should be enough of an instigator of action for governments and for the UN system to act.
And Naomi, forgive me, I'm down to my last 30 seconds here, but again, a question that probably has to be asked, is splitting the country in half, 2 countries, one for Christian, one for Muslim, is that a solution here?
Absolutely not. The international community must take every effort to ensure that the Central African Republic remains a unified country with both Muslims, Christians, and animists living together. And as we face a situation today where much of the Muslim community will actually be relocated by the United Nations out of their homes, all effort must be made to ensure that those displaced individuals are able to return and that the Central African Republic remains a unified country.
Naomi, it's always good of you to join us from Washington, D.C. on our program here in Toronto, your old hometown. Naomi Kikoler from the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. As always, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.